Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with James Gorey, author of The China Crisis, writer for the Epoch Times, and blogger on the BananaRepublican.com. He touches on the currency wars. Is the dollar's dominance dwindling? And what's China doing about it? Let's dive in. James, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Tiffany. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right now, there's wall-to-wall coverage on the Ukraine-Russia crisis, and a big focus on that is the sanctions and also moving a lot of Russian banks and things off the SWIFT exchange. So in that vein, how does China fit into all this?
Well, China is enabling Russia to do that. Russia has been subject to a lot of sanctions, as you mentioned. So much of that is grain exports and now oil as well. China is providing the much-needed market and liquidity for Russia to do that. And Russia is also helping China by purchasing or accepting yuan for those exchanges in grains and oil and so forth. So it's a symbiotic, one hand helps the other, one hand scrubs the other, as it were.
So there's been talks of Russia and China trying to kind of move off the SWIFT exchange and almost create their own. I think you've also written about this. So in your kind of take, what's happening there?
Sure. China formed what's called the SIPs, which is their alternative kind of SWIFT counterpart. SWIFT was designed to facilitate the transaction and trade in dollars. And China's system, which was started in 2015, was basically the same thing in renminbi, although it's got 1/10 probably the use in terms of banking and financial institutions. But they are accessing more and more partners with that, and Russia's part of that. Iran's part of that. Saudi Arabia may become part of that as well. So, as China grows in power and exerts itself, that is becoming more of an issue for SWIFT and for the dollar-denominated institutions.
And James, you recently wrote an article titled, "What is the biggest threat to the U.S. dollar?" So what is the biggest threat to the U.S. dollar?
Ultimately, the dollar is a fiat currency. And so the U.S. has been the hegemon, the global leader for most of the world, especially the developed world, since the end of World War II. So the U.S. dollar has been the currency, the reserve currency, and it's what oil has been sold in for the last 40, 50 years. The world market runs basically 70%, 80% on U.S. dollars. However, because it's a fiat currency, much of that attraction has been the security and strength and stability of the U.S., okay, the confidence that the rest of the world has in the U.S. So I write particularly that it's not the instability or the instability, rather, of the rest of the world that threatens the U.S. dollar as much as it is the instability that the rest of the world sees in the U.S. So think back to 2008 and 2009 with the great financial crisis. What happened? The world's currencies or the world's investors and so forth, put their money in U.S. bonds, Treasury bonds. Flight to safety, it's called, because people had confidence. The world had confidence that the U.S. economy was in command and control, and the U.S. wouldn't let the system fail. That hasn't been the case in the last 18 months or so. A number of foreign policy problems, whether it's our exit from Afghanistan, which was a disaster, and whether it's our inability to meet Russia and prevent Russia, deter Russia from their invasion of Ukraine, whether it's our ambiguity with regard to Taiwan and defending it, so much so that Japan issued a white paper last summer saying, look, our security depends on Taiwan security, and as a reminder to the U.S., there's a lot of foreign problems that are casting doubt on U.S. leadership, and domestically, it's our $5 trillion plus spending in the last 18 months that has just added tremendous amounts of debt to the dollar. So there's just a lot of problems here that are casting doubt on America's leadership, and we're not seeing leadership on the world stage like we did before.
Is the dollar's dominance kind of dwindling, and is China maybe seeing an opportunity and trying to squeeze in? What's your take?
Well, sure, it's dwindling, and it's not just an opportunity, but it's an opportunity that China has helped create. In other words, you can't replace a dollar-denominated system with nothing. You have to create something before you do that, and you have to make it function and get participants to sign off on, to use it. So China is doing that very, very quickly, and they've been doing that very diligently for the last several years. The digital yuan, or the e-yuan, or however, there's a variety of names for it, but basically the central bank digital currency that debuted during the Olympics in February, that was a big deal. And a lot of folks kind of said, well, it didn't do that well relative to other payment systems, but that wasn't the point. The point was China was the first kind of big developed economy to debut a central bank digital currency, and that's kind of a Sputnik moment. That puts them ahead of the game. That gives people pause. And again, if you're not having confidence in the economy of the reserve currency, or the way that country, the U.S. in this case, comports itself abroad and controls situations and resolves situations, if that's not happening, then there is that opportunity, and China knows full well that that's the case, and they are taking advantage of it.
You also mentioned in your article a shift in world order, almost away from the U.S. hegemony. So how do you see that playing out, especially with the Russia-Ukraine war and kind of China being vague on that?
There are a lot of ways to be a hegemonic power. I mean, the classic is you have a culture that translates well, that is mutually beneficial, a cultural and economic system, a political system. So the liberal democratic order has been just that. I mean, countries typically do better in it than they do outside of it. That's why China did so much to be accepted into the World Trade Organization back in 2000. They said whatever they had to say to get in it because they knew that without being a part of it, life was much more difficult. So the U.S. World Economic Order, that's shifting, and we can see Russia. Russia was about that, but it's not just about kind of putting a border or a buffer between NATO and Russia. Yeah, that's part of it, but there's a smarter play there, I think, and that's capturing or controlling food supplies. So between Russia and Ukraine, that's about a third of the world's grain exports, and Russia has effectively stopped Ukrainian grain exports, 80% of it anyway, through their southern ports. So they haven't taken maybe the fields, but they've taken over the methodology of how you transport, how you export it. So China is the same way. China is not ambivalent to Russia's invasion. They are fully in favor of it because there's a coordination there in terms of food supply. China has spent the last several years and maybe even a decade or two acquiring farmland. And it's the world's largest importer of food. It's also one of the world's largest owner of food-producing areas. So China has the ability to limit or control the flow of food on 4 continents. And Russia has that same ability with its occupation of Ukraine. So there's a lot of coordination in terms of how you restructure the global order. So that they're not going it through currency. They're doing it through currency as well. But, I mean, nobody wants the ruble at this point. Maybe come back by gold at some point. Directly, we'll see.
And what kind of effect would that have on Americans and their daily lives, or would it?
Well, if dollar-denominated assets, if the dollar is less valued, then we'll see higher interest rates to attract investment, right? To attract people to hold it. At some point, and we're already seeing interest rates rise, and we're seeing inflation. It could get ugly. It could certainly get ugly, and that would be something along the lines of people dumping dollar-denominated assets and going into some hard currency, or perhaps some kind of partially back digital currency like yuan, or like the digital ruble at some point, or maybe just gold or other types of hard currencies that are more or rather less encumbered with debt and with economic malaise. And we're seeing economic malaise here in the U.S. So I don't want to be it's not all doom and gloom, but there's certainly things to be concerned about. It's not inevitable, but policy matters.
James, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Tiffany. My pleasure.
That was James Gorrie, author of The China Crisis, writer for the Epoch Times, and blogger on the BananaRepublican.com.